Warning: this episode discusses sensitive topics including suicide. Conversations about suicide can be troublesome or difficult for some. If you or someone you know is thinking about suicide, please call or text 988 to connect to the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline or reach out to any local resources you may have.
Welcome to the Religious Treehouse. I'm Matthew.
I'm Jodie.
Awesome. So excited to be here today. How are you doing, Jodie?
I'm doing phenomenal. How are you, Matthew?
It's been a big news week in at the time of this recording, and it's been real exciting. I suppose the word is the word I'll use. Exciting, informative. A lot's been happening, so we're reacting to that. That's how I am.
I was going to hide the pain through the smiles.
Sure, sure. We're leaving it vague. I don't know what news week is happening where all this stuff,
No.
who knows? Who knows? But it has been a busy news week. Oh, cool. Well, I'm excited for our conversation today. We will be talking about the People's Temple, also known as Jonestown. So that'll be a nice change of pace from our, normal conversations about biblical studies and whatnot. So yeah, Jody, do you want to start us out with a very brief summary in case no one knows what this is?
Yeah, I'm just going to hit the major points. Starting off, Jim Jones starts the People's Temple in Indiana. He sees that it's reaching people and wants to reach even more, so they move the operation to Northern California. There, he gets kind of a reputation and has some criticisms coming his way. So he says, let's move our operation down to Guyana. And from there, they make a life. Some concerned people raise alarms in America. A congressman goes down to visit, and a very bad massacre happens. And
Yeah.
then it just spreads. The news spreads to the media. And here we are today with the popular phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, no, this is probably like one of the most famous like alternative religious movements that have like gone wrong. So this will be exciting to talk about. But yeah, do you want to just get started in Indiana, maybe at the beginning?
Yeah, let's start in Indiana. Marceline and Jim Jones, they start the People's Temple 2 years after they get married. Jim gets the money he takes a loan out and starts the People's Temple. They have three children, no, four children, one
Sure.
biological. They adopted two Asian children, and then they were also the first couple to adopt a Black child in Indiana. And according to Stephen Jones, their biological son, Jim Jones enjoyed flying in the face of social convention and was very proud of that, which isn't surprising considering the People's Temple was founded on ideas of racial equality.
Yeah, no, this was in the 1950s, right? So like this was on like, the forefront of the civil rights movement and stuff like that. So it was a very progressive church, very much focused on racial integration and stuff like that. And I don't think it's just him making a show out of, adopting um, non-white children. I think there's some like genuineness out of that. Like I don't think it was just a show. Like this was a very racially focused church, trying to integrate that in the divisiveness of the 50s. But yeah, definitely the starting point as a progressive church in Indiana.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with the genuineness of Marceline, but that's mostly through what I've heard through the lens of her son, Stephen Jones,
Sure.
in the documentaries I watched. But they start getting traction, they start making moves and attracting people, and the church is growing. So they decide to move their operation to Northern California.
Yeah, also to go to a place that's a bit more accepting of, racial differences. I mean, having a such a progressive church in Indiana probably isn't going to be too successful.
So they moved to Northern California and they're doing church services at the same time as another church.
Yeah, it's like the Church of the Golden Rule. I think. the Christ Church of the Golden Rule. Yeah. So they kind of like pair up with a separate church. And that, goes well for a while. They both have like the same goals. They want to feed the hungry, clothe the poor, share resources and live communally. The idea of like living communally and sharing resources is like a big thing, as we see later in Guyana for sure. But I think Jones wanted to have a little more power than he would have had in sharing a church. So they kind of split off. And at that point, it was in Northern California, like north of San Francisco, in a fairly white area that didn't allow for much, racial diversity. So I think at that point, they kind of moved down to San Francisco for the most part.
Okay, that seems a little counterproductive to the idea of unity and community to split the church. But if there was a difference in how much racial integration should be allowed, I could see that.
Sure. But yeah, so they moved down to San Francisco, and I feel like that's kind of when they start spreading. They do a lot of work on, Vietnam veterans, the poor, the homeless, again, focusing on a lot of racial inequality and being voices on that front. So like it's a good message. Like they're doing good things. Like I think for the most part, we would agree that all of these things that they're doing are helpful and good. And the standard idea of Christianity of helping the poor and stuff like that, where it diverges from a lot of mainstream Christianity, especially at this time. As I think Jones had some Marxist tendencies, especially with the communal living aspect of it. I think, if I remember correctly, the Communist Party of the U.S. said, no, Jim Jones, we disagree, we're not on the same page. But there was this idea of this, socialist, if I don't know if I would say communist idea of his, but at least a socialist idea that Jones wanted to promote, in the sense that he wanted a communal living space, living together, kind of like sharing resources and stuff like that.
Yeah. And parallel to this, though, Jim Jones is making some questionable decisions in his personal life and in the leadership of the church.
Right.
He has started to take on mistresses. His wife, Marceline, at one point finds out, is distraught, but still lets people know that she's willing to share her husband with the church. And he starts sleeping with Caroline Layton. She divorces her husband. She was married at the time their affair started. And she's not the only woman within the People's Temple leadership Jim Jones is sleeping with. And so they start to get a reputation as having a more scandalous inner circle, and it causes some division within the church. There are younger members of the congregation who write a manifest saying they wish to separate because while all of these things they're doing are well and good, they don't appreciate the sex cult type aspects of it. It said that Jim Jones would have people perform acts on each other in front of each other, that as a punishment, he would have people strip each other down. The big thing, though, for me, is that the leadership within the church did not reflect the congregation. They were so forward moving for racial equality, yet the inner circle of the People's Temple was predominantly white.
Yeah. And we see that today. Like a lot of people that say like, hey, we should be racially inclusive. It's often, white people doing who are we to talk? But it's a lot of times, white people up on top trying to be racially inclusive and, maybe not reaching the standards we may want to see. But I also think this is a good point to note that a lot of the instances of these religious movements that go wrong often have this sexual component to it. A lot of times when you think of the word cult, and I think we'll talk about the connotations that has later, but when you think of the word cult, there's often and not all the time, but there's often the sense of a leader using sex as an abuse of power. And I think that's, somewhat of a common sign to see when religious movements go wrong. And having this identification with What's the one down south in Southern California? The Family, maybe. I don't know. But there's a bunch. Waco. Think about Waco with David Koresh. Like there's a sexual element there. So a lot of these cults, if we want to use the word cult, where these religious movements go wrong, often starts to some extent with sexual abuse on the leader's part.
Yeah. So that gets them some not so great press.
Sure.
And judgment starts coming down on Jim Jones and the People's Temple. There are news articles coming out, and he starts to fear the perception they have in California. And they had bought this land in Guyana, and it initially was presented to the member of the People's Temple as a retreat. But Jim Jones starts moving people down there as more of a permanent move for the People's Temple.
You're saying that Jones presented this like to the congregation, like, hey, this is a retreat place?
According to the documentaries,
Okay.
It was initially presented to them as a place for them to go down as a retreat to kind of refresh before continuing to do their work in society.
Okay. I think I don't know, the sources I read, Rebecca Moore primarily, it seemed to be the real reason. I don't know how he presented it to his congregation, but the reason that they were looking for a land outside of the U.S. were some problems locally in the U.S. I think they denounced the Siamese Liberation Army, the SLA. So I think they had some beef with them that gave them reason to kind of get out of the area. I think they also were risking their chance of losing the tax exempt status, which again is a big deal. And then they had some other reasons, such as I think critiques and bad press to kind of like give them a reason to look for a place outside of America.
I think a lot of what we see when looking at the People's Temple is a lot of conflicting stories and themes.
Sure.
There was a lot of conflicting information at the time, and there's still conflicting information today.
Yeah.
Because what we'll talk about later is that plans were made within the inner circle that did not make it to the congregation.
Right.
So they have this plot in Guyana. They start moving down there.
Right. They started making the plot or clearing the land at least in 1974, right? So that was, and what everyone knows about the People's Temple is the massacre that happened. So this was 4 years before that, the massacre in 1978. So like this was like a project in the works.
Yes, the People's Temple Agricultural Project is what the sign read when you walked in. They started a hospital, a school. They had a bakery, a sawmill. It was a functional small city.
Yeah.
They were able to sustain themselves as they presented to the world. They made a video even showing how great it was there to show this picture perfect utopia. But underneath, there are reports that there wasn't enough food, that they were struggling to keep everyone fed and clothed.
Yeah.
So what was presented may not have been the reality. And concerned relatives started to speak up. And that really started, I feel like, with Grace Stone. She was one of the people who had slept with Jim Jones while they were in Northern California. She had a child, John Victor. They did not know who his biological father was, but she and her husband and John Victor all moved down to Guyana with Jim Jones and the People's Temple, and they left Grace and George Stone without John Victor. And in the United States, started the process of filing for custody and letting Congressman Leo Ryan know what was going on, because they had defected and they wanted custody of their son back.
Right.
Along with multiple other families.
Yeah. Okay. Definitely. Yeah. No, definitely. And I think concerned relatives was like the group title of these people, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
So
concerned relatives.
the concerned relatives also consisted of brothers and sisters who were very concerned by the conditions down in South America, who just really wanted to make sure their family members were okay.
Yeah. And like honestly, a great name. Like they encaptured it well. They were relatives who were concerned,
Yep.
concerned relatives. Oh, but yeah, and there were a lot of news articles and stuff like that coming out that they would have, catharsis sessions. This was still in California, I think, where there were sessions that were there to like criticize and correct social behavior through, beratement or corporal punishment. Uh, and I think there were healing services that were faked, that were like people like knew obviously were faked. Um, so like there were instances of sketchy things happening like throughout. Like there's no doubt behind that.
So are we finally in 1978, would you say?
Yeah, I think we can at least go to seven. They started. They all the big movement was in '77, right? Like most of them all kind of migrated in '77 until. So they're there for
Yeah.
a solid year because
And
it was in
even
November when the all the deaths
jo-
occurred.
Jones didn't even get there until I think 1977. And there was a
Right.
time before him. And Stephen Jones, in the documentary I watched on Hulu, commented on the fact that there was a shift once his
Mhm.
father truly started living there, that there was a shift in the temperament. There was a shift in just the way people felt. There was a different energy his dad brought about. But
Yeah,
until
and that
that
makes
point,
sense.
he reflects on it being a great community to be a part of.
Yeah, yeah. No, they were like working on the land and like trying to prepare the the buildings and stuff for at least 3 years. And by the time they got there, it wasn't like fully like set up and ready yet. They weren't like expecting that mass influx of however many people there were, 900 or something like that, maybe more. Like they weren't expecting that influx yet, but like the living conditions and stuff were still like fine. Like they're good to live to like some extent. Like it was no city living, it wasn't San Francisco. They were still had acceptable good living conditions.
Yeah. And then they start having people to defect. So yeah, let's stay a little bit before 1978. There were people defecting. People were trying to leave, and people were leaving. So much so that Jim Jones took people's passports
Interesting.
and was not going to let them leave. And that's according to Stephen Jones. Once his father arrived, he started taking people's passports. Jim Jones was addicted to phenobarbital. He was behaving differently according to Stephen. He would get on the loudspeaker and would just be yapping at everyone, moving around at all times during the day,
Hmm.
teaching, prophesizing, things like that. So the temperament had changed and people wanted to leave. One woman defected days before Rebecca Moore's parents went to visit. And they were also the parents of Caroline Layton, one of Jim Jones's mistresses, and Annie Moore, who was a nurse. And they went, visited. There was all these articles coming out from the defector to combat that. From what I remember, they were asked by their daughters to hold a press conference and say, we went down there. It was nice. The Moores talked highly about Jonestown.
Hmm.
But still, you had this defectee who had just gone to the embassy saying, they're beating people. They won't let us sleep. They're doing experiments on us. They're doing these things called white knight trials, where they're telling us that we're practicing to drink poison.
Yeah. And they would also have nights of like uh, or they would also have like rituals where they would like um they would drink the poison and stuff as like a ritual idea, and then the White Knights would happen where they would like pretend they were under attack. They were like told they're under attack, and they would act accordingly, however that may be. So yeah, there's stuff going on that wouldn't be typical in your regular society.
So all of this happens. We do get finally to 1978. Congressman Leo Ryan wants to visit. So he and media teams, including NBC and the San Francisco Examiner, get together with concerned relatives, including Grace Stone, and they go down to Georgetown. Now, the People's Temple did have a base in Georgetown, but that wasn't where a majority of the People's Temple lived. So they still wanted to get to Jonestown.
Georgetown's the capital of Guyana, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So they had to get a plane, and it took multiple days for them to finally get a plane. But once they did, they flew over, and they had to take an hour-long truck ride to go 3 miles. They landed in Port Kaituma, had to take the truck 3 hours to Jonestown. They weren't getting a welcome reception from the get-go. They even got a poster that I believe said "Go Back Yankees" at one point, because the people of Jonestown did not want them coming. At this point, Jim Jones had told them, people are going to come for us. They're going to try to take you away from me. He had this fear because the Stones were trying to get John Victor back, and he couldn't let that happen, because it would set a precedent that other people could be taken away through legal means. But finally, they get the okay to go to Jonestown. And not everyone who was on the plane to Georgetown flew from Georgetown to Port Kaituma. It was an even smaller group. So they still left people in Georgetown. But the Port Kaituma group gets together. You have Don Harris from NBC. You have Congressman Leo Ryan and his aide, whose name is Jackie Spader. They go with some media people, again from NBC and the San Francisco Examiner, into Jonestown, and they are met with this feast. There's this giant celebration. No one has seen Jim Jones yet, but there was performances, people talking about how much they love Jonestown, how happy they are to be there. Congressman Leo Ryan gets up and gives this speech about how he's talked to people, and they seem very positive and happy about where they live. There was this giant applause, and people are smiling. Now, if you watch the documentaries, the people who were there as reporters will say they felt off. They felt this weird energy. And you can't really know if that is colored by what happened the next day.
Yeah. No, I think that's a interesting comment, because when I did undergrad, there was an alternative religious movement that I would visit every once in a while because I was studying religion and stuff. So I'd check them out, and like they were the nicest people I met. They're like super nice. They're always welcoming, always happy to answer my questions. They're like super nice. And I had a pastor friend, and I said, "Hey, like, have you heard about this people?" He's like, "No," because he liked learning about that type of stuff. He liked learning about religious movements and stuff like that. But he's also a very conservative Christian. So he went down to check it out. And he's like, that is just infested with demons. I got the weirdest vibes. It was just scary. So I think a lot of the like feelings that you get when going to a place have these preconceived notions that like are the biggest part of it. Like I don't know what happened, how they actually felt, what was actually happening there. But I think is perhaps likely that they felt like stuff was off because that's what they expected to feel. That's what they were expecting to see.
So they're going through this giant feast. Everything seems perfect. And finally, Jim Jones appears. And around the time that Jim Jones appears, there's also people giving notes to a reporter, which was not okay, according to survivors of the People's Temple, that they were prohibited from talking directly with them. They leave that night. They go stay in Port Kaituma. They return the next day, with the intention to take however many people want to leave. Don Harris, a reporter for NBC, actually confronts Jim Jones with the notes. And there's reports from the people who were there that day that there was a visible shift in Jim Jones's demeanor once he is confronted with these notes. And while this is happening, Jackie Spader, Congressman Leo Ryan's aide, is getting oral affidavits from people saying they wish to leave. And once Don Harris is done confronting Jim Jones, he goes over and starts talking to the people who are giving their oral affidavits saying, oh, don't leave. You're so important to me. I can't do this without you. And Jackie Spader's trying to get these oral affidavits, trying to help these people get their things together. She at one point encounters a guard in a room who seems like he's going to keep a woman from gathering her stuff. Luckily, there's no altercation. But they get 15 people together and put them in a truck. Congressman Leo Ryan says he's going to stay and wait to see if there are more people. And what they don't know is that the previous night, I should have mentioned this earlier, due to the distraction of Congressman Leo Ryan, a group of people have actually just left. 11 people just packed up. While everyone else was at this feast, they used the distraction to just leave. So that's 11 people gone. There's 15 people on the truck. Congressman Leo Ryan at the pavilion where they held their meetings. He's getting ready to see if more people want to come on the next truck, and he is attacked. The first assassination attempt happens. A man lunges at him with a knife. Someone else grabs this man's hand and stabs the attacker. And Congressman Leo Ryan comes kind of stumbling out of the pavilion, if you see it on the footage, and he gets in the truck, and their thought is, we need to go. We need to get out of there.
All right.
So they get to the airstrip. They're calling. I think they had a second plane already ready at this point. They're at the airstrip. Remember, it takes an hour to get from Jonestown to the airstrip. During this time, I believe it was Tim Carter who recounts Jim Jones saying, I think someone's going to do something. I think something is going to happen. And lo and behold, as they are getting people on the plane, a tractor and a trailer pull up and they start opening fire on the people at the airstrip. And 5 individuals are killed, including Congressman Leo Harris, not Leo
Ryan.
Harris, Leo Ryan, Don Harris. Trying to find our list.
Yeah, it was the congressman, 3 journalists, and a member of the temple.
Yeah, and a defector. So they're killed. At one point, the shooting stops. The gunmen kind of look around, and this is according to accounts from people there, and they leave. Back at the People's Temple, the gunmen return. They talk to Jim Jones, and Tim Carter is the one recounting this in the documentary. Mm-hmm. And Jim Jones calls out to everyone, the congressman is dead. At this point, it doesn't matter who shot him, and this is me paraphrasing. It doesn't matter who shot him, I might as well have. They're going to come for us. And then we get to what happens next and why it's famously known as Jonestown. They prepare or had prepared.
Yeah.
This was already in the wheels had already started turning on this at this point, don't you think?
Yeah, no, at this point, like, they had concluded that what needed to happen was a mass suicide or something along those lines. So I think this had been prepared for some time. They were just waiting for the right time, the right moment for it to be like, okay, this is when we should do it. And, you know, after Congressman Leo Yeah, Leo Ryan, after he got shot and killed and all that stuff, they figured, okay, this is now the time. So chaos ensued. It all happened. They killed the children first, and once all the children died, then they uh, they drank the Kool-Aid, as the saying goes, all together, and then something like over 900 people died in total. So yeah, and that's all, and that's like what this is all known for, obviously.
Yeah. So U.S. Special Services had to go out and count the bodies and identify them. And when they arrived, they noticed obviously the flavor aid mixed with cyanide, but they also noticed that there were syringes littering the tables, and people had marks and showed signs of struggling, of being held down. So what you can kind of draw, if you want to draw a conclusion from that, is that not everyone was willing. This was not a completely consensual event.
Yeah, no, there's big debate on like whether this could be considered mass murder or mass suicide. Like obviously the children were murdered, like there's no question about that. And I think most of the elderly people there, who couldn't really speak for themselves, couldn't really fight for themselves, I think that's fairly often considered murder. But like for the able-bodied and able-minded people who actively chose to take their own lives, and which I think is a very large percentage of the people, is that considered murder or suicide? And I think that's part of the legacy of the People's Temple. Like what actually how do we actually classify this?
Yeah, and it really, the thought of all the people who had already defected either by leaving or leaving with the congressman, you already get this sense that there was quite a few of them that did not want this, that this is not the end they saw for themselves. They were living in this beautiful utopia. They had truly beautiful ideas of racial equality and a community building that I think a lot of people could resonate with today.
Yeah.
But it ended in this horrible, horrible tragedy. And they have a mass grave up in Oakland, California.
Yeah. And I think it's important to talk about how this has been framed, especially immediately after the period. And I think I'm relying on Irving Goffman's frame theory here for the most part, as also proposed by Rebecca Moore. Rebecca Moore, by the way, is a professor, or she might be retired now, but she was a professor at San Diego State University, and her two sisters died in the massacre. So and I consider her to be one of the experts on Jonestown and the People's Temple. She writes about it extensively. She has a website, Alternative Views of Jonestown or something like that, which is a great resource. But using frame theory being kind of like a schemata of interpretation that allows people to identify events and stuff like that, to assign blame. So if we kind of like create these frames of interpretation, and I think there's a few important frames that we need to talk about. First off, what Rebecca Moore has called the public agent narrative. Once Congressman Leo Ryan died, it legitimized all the bad things that had been said about the People's Temple, whether justified or not. It legitimized all of the reporting that was against the temple, like this is a bad temple, which is why you don't hear often the conversation about, hey, they did a lot of good things, they did a lot of racial reconciliation work, a lot of stuff like that, because it's been framed as the way of, okay, they killed this guy and they all died as well, so it's framed as this very, very bad thing, and that's the thing that gets picked up on as legitimate. And then we also get the narrative of the members of the group, which wasn't immediately available after the massacre because most of them died. So, but like as time goes on, because this was extensively recorded, there's tons of tapes that recording all this, and letters and notes and stuff. it was promoting this countercultural idea of like communal living, and a lot of it was like positive. A lot of them were happy with it, but at the same time, with the reporters dying, it gives other reporters the incentive to depict Jonestown, the People's Temple, at its absolute worst. So because this is reporters reporting on fellow reporters dying, like they're going to report on this as if it was awful, and it was awful, but that's the only thing that they're going to focus on. So as that narrative is framed in the public mind, that's what we focus on. We focus on the worst parts of the People's Temple, and we focus on not the religious institution, not the religion. We focus on these events at the end, and we say that these events are what we think of the People's Temple now, and that's how we frame the entire situation. And there's other. What were you saying?
Well, I was going to say, this is also the media, like after things like the Red Scare, like the media has a tendency to lean a certain way when reporting on things like this. Not that this is, even equivocal to the Red Scare, but the way the media frames things, there's always a tilt toward the dire.
Sure.
Towards the negative, I feel like.
Yeah. But I also think this was, the beginning of the anti-cult narrative. Like, I think that's another way this was framed, and I think this kind of started it. Maybe earlier you get, Patty Hearst, and, the brainwashing incident with the SLA. But for the most part, I think this kind of starts the anti-cult movement. And, and then we get that with all these other cults that come around, and the media always portrays them negatively, sometimes rightfully so, sometimes not. But the idea that, especially the 90s, I think it really peaked in the 90s, the anti-cult narrative, but I think this started it. And so by framing this as cults are bad, all alternative religious movements are bad, it frames all other alternative religious movements, and it frames this one as just bad because it is a cult. By being a cult, it is bad. And then that's justified again by the what Rebecca Moore calls the apostate narrative. As the terrible news leaked, the press talked to members who left the group, and the people who left the group already had reasons to be upset at the group for whatever reason. So by using the people who were upset at the group for it just didn't work out for them, that frames the narrative in a way that this is very negative, this is very bad. And again, it focuses on, hey, how do we hate this group? How can we focus on the tragedy? And like right, part of it's rightfully so. Part of it is like, yeah, 900 people died. This is horrible. They murdered a congressman. Like, this is awful. But at the same time, you never talk about the other aspects of it. You never talk about the racial inequality, because we're focusing on that apostate narrative of the people who defected, the people who left beforehand have this very particular view. And I think Rebecca Moore does good at acknowledging that. I think Rebecca Moore, whose sisters died in that, acknowledges that there's that view that the people who left have, and she's got her view skewed because her own family died. So I think that's just, we have to be aware of how this has been framed for us and how we think about these views before we just kind of assign blame and think about how this all interworks. And like, why do we only hear about the mass killing? Why don't we hear about, like before I studied religion, before I got into religious studies, like I'd heard of Jonestown, obviously, but I couldn't have told you anything about like what they believed, what they did.
Yeah, reflecting on that time when the media came in, I think about the footage of Stephen Jones getting basically interrogated. He had just found out that all these people he knew and loved and had worked to build a community with died while he was at a basketball tournament.
Yeah.
The way that must have shaken his world, because they weren't asking him about the people who had died, about the people he had worked with, about what loss it was for him. They were asking him, was your father a madman? Was this planned? Was this, and really focusing on the darkness of it. I completely agree with you. I could not have told you before watching these things what good there was. And there was good. You can't say there wasn't any good. People aren't going to be drawn into these kind of things for pure evil. There has to be an appeal of some sort.
Yeah. And then you get conspiracy theories that pop up from this, because it's only depicted in one way. And I think that might be part of it, because it's depicted as this horrible event. I think that gives rise to the conspiracy theory aspect of it. Like, something's off there. We're not getting the full story. So the conspiracy comes in, this conspiracy theorist comes in and makes up their own story. And you get crazy things with this, especially since, internet has become as widespread as it is. But I've heard some where it's the CIA who orchestrated this murder so that they could move heroin from Guyana into the United States on their dead bodies. Like, there's horrible conspiracy theories that are attached to this. And it's so crazy how this is just framed in all these weird ways.
That's disgusting, especially when you can already say so many true negative things about it.
Yeah.
Like, there are so many negative things that are true. That Jim Jones, like Stephen Jones, reflecting on his dad, says his dad showed these tendencies to care more about people's perception of him than he did to care about what he was actually doing. Like, he more cared how people celebrated. Like, that could be labeled narcissistic. You could talk about that. You could talk about the fact that he had a pet monkey that he had saved, and they found the monkey, it was shot after. Annie Moore, it said that Annie Moore was the person to shoot Jim Jones and then give herself the cyanide. There are so many details that you could talk about. Tim Carter, this is the most heartbreaking one. Tim Carter was sent to the Russian embassy in Georgetown. He was sent on a mission by Jim Jones. And as a final middle finger to the United States, Jim Jones sent 3 briefcases full of money to the Russian embassy via Tim Carter. And when Tim Carter returned, he found his wife and his child dying in the pavilion amongst 20 other bodies. This is a real tragedy. This affected real people. There are still people alive today who remember that.
Yeah.
And we can't just continue to look at things through the negativity of the evil without asking ourselves, why did they end up there?
Yeah, no, because I think, when we said this before, but I think it offered a view of reality that is really convincing to a lot of people. It was, they Jim Jones focuses theology. It kind of paralyzed, the social gospel, focusing on social justice, and it drew a lot from Black church traditions as well. And they had some other beliefs, they kind of at the end had Jim Jones as kind of an enfleshment of the divine, and perhaps the idea of reincarnation that might not be as typical Christianity, but they offered this view of reality that I think a lot of people today would find very compelling. They offered this view of reality that said, hey, we can do something to fix the inequality, we can fix the broken, we can live together and be happy, and offered this good view that theoretically, before all the power structures and stuff fall apart, that is compelling. And I think a lot of people, if not most of the people in Guyana, most of the people part of the group, I think they were happy. I think they enjoyed it. Looking in on it from the outsider perspective, is they had problems. It may not be for us. It may not be what we like. The physical abuse that you mentioned, maybe that works to some extent in their religious needs. I don't think that's good or right, and that should be, called out, and that should be questioned, that should be stopped.
Yeah.
But if we recognize that this could be good for some people, before the death aspect of it, I think that's something we should acknowledge, that this was good up until it wasn't for these people.
And I think a lot of people who look at things like Jonestown in a very negative view are always those people who are like, oh, that could never be me. I could never join a religious alternative movement. And I'm like, well, I will gladly admit I could see it.
Yeah.
I could see myself there.
Yeah.
Because you're promising me a world where we can treat everyone equally, where everyone equally contributes, where we care for one another, where it's not looking out for me, myself, and I.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but sign me up. To a certain extent.
When we learned about Jonestown in undergrad, my professor, like it was a 2-hour class, and he spent the first half hour like doing a hypothetical situation, and he did like he found like 3 or 4 people that are responsible for climate change and like all these horrible things, and he like gave this impassioned speech about like, if we killed these 3 or 4 people, it would make everyone richer, it would make everyone happier, all these things. And at the end of it, he asked the class, like, should we kill these people? Like, should these people be killed to solve this problem? And I'd say, 60 to 75% of the class like raised their hand. And he said, see, that's how easy it is for in half an hour to convince you to join this cult, to have these ideas of like murder, just be like, yeah, this is cool. So I think the idea of one, being convinced to do something as horrible as this isn't as hard as we'd like to think it is. And also, especially if it's joining something that's doing real good, that like on the surface looks like it's doing things that we want in the world, creating racial equality and stuff like that, it's really easy to join and be part of it. And there's a lot of religious movements out there that offer this, that offer, promises of racial equality and social justice and stuff like that, that aren't, influenced by this powerful leadership dynamic of that Jim Jones offered, and that actually do a lot of good. And this idea of the word cult as like a derogatory term has become so, I hate the word cult. Cult is a 4-letter word. It's awful. And we should think about how when we use the word cult, all that really means is it's a religion that we don't like. It's a religion that we're trying to put down. And it's been overcome by representing Jonestown, by representing, the Waco with David Koresh, the Branch Davidians, and like all these other, Charles Manson. When you think of cult, you think of these bad things. So when there's a new alternative religious movement, a new religion that's small, that you're unfamiliar with, and you label it as this cult, as the scary thing, like the one near my undergrad that my pastor friend was scared of, like it distorts reality. And I hate it. Like, we need to acknowledge that these alternative religious movements, just because they're not yours, just because they're small, and just because you don't really understand it, doesn't mean they're necessarily bad, because a lot of them do good.
Definitely. I think I still need a word for the bad ones, though, because I think there are still some really bad things.
Yeah. And I think we could come to some terms. We could talk about, a fundamentalist group, extremist group, perhaps an extremist religious group, maybe the best terminology that we could have. But no, I propose alternative religious movement, ARM, something like that would be the best way to talk about these religious movements that aren't, mainstream and known about per se.
I could get down with that.
Yeah.
I could get down with ARM.
ARM.
So a couple weeks ago, we talked about Masada.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, are there any comparisons we can make between the two of these?
I mean, I've seen people try to make comparisons, particularly when I study Masada, less so when I study Jonestown, because Jonestown is much more well known. Masada is less well known. And they try, like the what they have going for them is they have a similar number of deaths. The mass suicide at Masada and mass suicide in Jonestown are about 950 deaths. So they have that going for them. And it's, this religious movement doing these things. But I think they're vastly different. Like they can't be compared. Um, First of all, if they're 2,000 years apart, the cultural ideas of everything going on are just completely different. One of them was in war; they were in wartime, um, and I think any comparison to the two is generally misfounded. I don't know. I don't know if you agree, but
no, it's really hard. It's hard to wrap my mind comparing the two of them. I guess because, in my view, like the invasion that was coming for them at Jonestown, I really felt like it was a safe haven. I don't trust what Jim Jones was doing. I don't trust what his intentions were. I think the People's Temple as a congregation had the best intentions, that they had the best interest of their group, of their collective. And I believe that what Congressman Leo Ryan would have brought back for them would have been help. I think what the Jews at Masada were faced with was a true destruction of themselves. But I truly feel such disdain for Jim Jones, and that I don't want to use the term brainwashed, but that he distorted a reality, that he preached a rhetoric that anyone who was coming for them, what was truly coming for them, because they did believe in their collective, in themselves as a collective, and that if they were coming for him, then the military was going to come for them too and kill them too. But I don't think that's true. I think that waiting on the other side for them was family members who would have loved to have them back. And I don't want to cry. Oh my gosh. I just don't think you can compare the two, because I really think what happened at Jonestown was so unnecessary and was at the sacrifice of one man's, and probably a few men, because the gunmen weren't innocent, but they were answering for the crimes of one man.
Right, and that's not to say Masada was justified. I don't think death in war or in peace. I don't think either way is justified per se. But no, it's especially being much more modern, being in American culture that we're much more familiar with. It can be a lot easier to find an emotional bond to what's happening in Jonestown.
No, and I think with Masada, more my thought is like the fear of the Romans. I feel that those in Masada had more of a justified fear of the Romans, and I could be wrong.
Yeah, no, like that one, like as we talked about in the Masada episode, like as Josephus claims, like they did it because they had the choice between slavery or death, and they said we don't want to be slaves to the Romans, so they said this is the solution. Very very different situation, and I don't think they can be compared.
No, definitely.
But yeah, I think outside of that, I think if they never moved to Guyana, if they just had their collective in San Francisco or wherever it was, I think the legacy of Jonestown would be very different. I think it would be this very progressive movement that we would consider to be highly perhaps pushing the ideas of socialism a little more than a lot of people would like, but I think it would have this legacy of social justice, of helping the people and doing all that. But once it moved to Guyana, it really fell apart.
Have you ever seen the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood?
No.
So they present this alternative to what would have happened the night the Manson family attacked and killed Sharon Tate. And they present this like just an alternative history of what could have been if they had gone into a different house, if they had gone into the house of a stepman who was able to kick their butts and take them down, and what that would have looked like. So can I give a little Once Upon a Time for the People's Temple.
Sure, I suppose. I think we'll end on that, I guess.
Because I think you're right. I think they would have been known for their progressive views. I think they would have had, there was that weird spotty history with the sex cult thing with Jim Jones, but maybe he would have been held accountable for things he did, and the people would have been able to flourish and have a commune, a community, and be known as those weird hippies, because that is honestly a little bit of what it is.
Yeah.
And it's just this, it's the hope. It's the hope that for them, that I think maybe in another universe, in another timeline, that all of those people got to see their dreams become a reality.
Yeah. No, it's fun to speculate and think about that stuff. But I think that's all we have. Do you have anything else that we want to bring up before we
just tears?
Close it out? Just tears. Amen. All right. So thank you all for listening. If you have any questions or thoughts, please leave those in the comments or reach out to us. Follow us on all the social medias, Instagram, TikTok, Bluesky, Twitter, Facebook. I think we're on Facebook. And then, if you're watching us on YouTube, great. You can also listen to us on Spotify or Apple or Amazon or wherever you get your podcasts. But please like and subscribe. Is that something people do? Did I say that right?
Yeah, like and subscribe.
Comment. And subscribe.
Leave comments. If I was too emotional, let me know.
5 stars or 4. I'll take 4 stars.
Heck, leave a scathing review.
Yeah. All right. Bye, all.
Bye.